Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Grant Shirk from Sisu Data. I'll be your behind the scenes host today for our virtual fireside chat. What's remote got to do with it? Building better, more collaborative analytics teams, no matter where you happen to be working. Before we get started, we have three great panelists joining us today, but I want to make sure that we cover some of the basic housekeeping and kind of rules of engagement for today's conversation. We're all quite good at Zoom and other video conferencing capabilities today, but wanted to call your attention to a couple of capabilities. As I mentioned, I'll be the behind the scenes host today. So if you are having any issues with audio, video, or the content itself, please feel free to chat me using the chat button in the lower toolbar of your window. Additionally, we will be taking live questions from the audience, and I will be managing and moderating that. So there is a Q&A tab also at the bottom of your panel. If you would like to ask a question, please go ahead and ask it there. You also, as an attendee, have the ability to vote up or add commentary onto existing questions. So please, we'll keep this going, and I will make sure that Sid, Emily, Simon, and Tristan have a relatively steady pattern of questions to get going. Now, with that said, I do want to step into our conversation today. And to do that, I would like to introduce you to Sid Sharma, who is a solutions engineer at Sisu. He's going to be moderating our conversation today and getting us started. How's it going, Sid?
Awesome. Thank you for the introduction, Grant. Hi, everyone. My name is Sid Sharma. And like Grant mentioned, I am a member of the solutions engineering team at Sisu. And I'm excited to be joined today by three guests who are familiar names in the data ecosystem and have a lot of experience working with and managing remote data teams. I'll let them introduce themselves. Let's start with you, Emily. If you could tell us a little bit about your background, where you work, and maybe a fun tidbit about your first experience working remote.
Thanks, Sid. I'm so glad to be here, and thanks so much for having me. So my name is Emily Sherrio. I've been at GitLab for just about 2 years now. GitLab is the single application for the entire DevOps lifecycle, from planning what you're going to build to deploying, monitoring, and securing and defending your application. I joined as our first data analyst, spent about a year in that role, moved into a data engineering role, and then have spent the last 9 months working in a strategy role on the chief of staff team. I live on the East Coast of the United States in Savannah, Georgia, with my dog and my husband. And I've spent pretty much my entire career working remotely. So no really entertaining stories there, but I will tell you, occasionally on a call, you can hear my dog snoring in the background. He has a dog bed that lives in my office. You can't see it now. But if you hear snoring, I promise it's not me. It's my very large rescue. So Simon, what was your first story?
Well, no dogs involved. But my first remote job actually wasn't even in tech. I was opening cafes for a chain of coffee shops. And in retrospect, actually, probably all of the suggestions and rules that we bring up today were just totally broken in that job. So it was educational, but in sort of the bad way. I've been at WordPress.com I'll have my 7th anniversary there this summer. And I mean, if you haven't heard of WordPress.com, it's a website that helps you build a website. Parent company Automattic is 11 or 1,200 people, fully remote, entirely distributed. We actually just acquired Tumblr, so we got a whole new chunk of folks, and it's a really great place to work and a really cool place to build a website too. Strong recommend. And I've been lucky enough to be leading remote teams there for probably five of the years that I've been with the company. And I'm actually super stoked to kind of hear what other folks' experiences are. It feels like there's so much to be learned in the remote space, even for us. Tristan, what about you?
I didn't realize that we were going to ask this question, so I didn't come prepared to the story. But as you folks are talking, it's taking me back to the early days of Fishtown Analytics. So I started Fishtown from my house in the city. It's actually in the neighborhood of Philadelphia called Fishtown. And for the first 6 months, I worked out of my home office there because it was really just me and my co-founder, Drew Bannon. And he was living in New York. And so I really just didn't see any humans for about 6 months, which is like a very different thing when you're working remotely and there's no one on Slack either. Like it gets pretty lonely pretty quickly. So I moved into a WeWork just so that I could like see other humans over the course of the day. Anyway, it's great to be here. My name's Tristan Handy. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Fishtown Analytics. We make an open source data tool called DBT. The main thing I want to say about DBT here is just that it helps data analysts work like software engineers. And software engineers have been thinking about how to work remotely for, I don't know, 40 plus years. Like the open source movement has its roots in like the 70s, and open source has always been fully remote. And so a lot of the things that we probably, maybe not most of the things, but many of the things that we talk about here today are going to be things that like software engineers in the open source ecosystem have been doing forever.
Awesome. I actually used DBT in my previous job, and it's awesome. I can attest to that fact.
Thanks.
Cool. So let's actually put remote aside for a bit. What are some of the things your team does to improve collaboration? What does good collaboration really look like? Let's start with you, Simon.
It's a great question. I think so much of working together sort of as humans outside of the remote environment, right? Any environment really comes down to understanding like our intent and really helping each other execute. And when I think about good collaboration, especially in a remote first environment, the key for me is really building in next steps and sort of ways for people to maintain the momentum of the work that needs to be done. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to be stealing most of this answer from Cal Newport. And I don't know if this was in Deep Work or one of his other books. And he talks about how anytime you send an email, and this I think is also true for Slack messages or whatever sort of platform that your team uses, is baking in like next steps for people and sort of offering them the sort of branching storyline to move forward. So instead of something like, hey, what's going on? Can I pick your brain for a second? And then 6 hours later, hearing back like, oh, hey, what's up? How can I help you? Much better is to offer context, right? Like, hey, this ping isn't urgent, but I really need your help with this question. And if the answer to this question is A, can you please ping this other person and let them know? But if the question is B, can you then like add a calendar appointment for me for us to talk about this more? So that way you sort of take yourself out as a blocker of momentum. And especially as your team spreads across time zones, sort of being able to stay efficient, even when you're not necessarily in synchronous communication, is so key for collaboration, at least in our environment.
Interesting. Do you have certain rules in place as to when to use Slack versus email versus a Zoom call?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a great question. For us, we really try to default to storing communication in a way that's really transparent and really searchable. And I love Zoom. It allows you to have this really dense conversation, and the information exchange is really unparalleled. You can't really pair program in an asynchronous medium, not yet. And in that way, there are times when that kind of synchronous, really high density exchange is needed. Things like onboarding and mentorship, I think synchronous conversations can have real value. But for the vast majority of the time, we really try to default to highly internally public and highly searchable forms of communication. And many times what that means is you sort of have to put those next steps. You've got to bake it in. And I like Slack, but I'm sure everyone, especially in the last 3 or 4 weeks, has had the experience of trying to scroll up through Slack to find where a decision was made. And especially with the threads, it can be a real challenge. And you're sort of introducing inefficiency into your process when it doesn't have to be there.
Interesting. Would you add anything to that, Emily?
Yeah, I think Simon's points around transparent communication are really spot on, and making it so people can understand not just what decision was made, but why a decision was made. That's really important for collaboration. I think another point I'd add there is short toes. So collaboration is one of our core values at GitLab, and one of the ways we live this out is by working with no ego and working with what we call short toes. And that's, anyone can kind of step in and bias towards action and solve a problem and not worry about stepping on anyone's toes. And that really enables us to keep things going when people are asleep or out on vacation or whatever it might be. What about you, Tristan? Anything to add there?
I really love, but even before you explained what short toes meant, I like understood immediately what that. It's a really great way of putting that. I was actually going to say a very similar thing, that in this environment, you know, like there's this. I started my career at Deloitte Consulting, and at Deloitte Consulting, at least when I was there back in the very early 2000s, it may be very different now. There was a little bit of a culture of FaceTime. So you stayed at the office as late as possible to demonstrate to everybody else that you were working really hard. And, you know, there's a million things wrong with that. And I'm sure that that's, my guess is that that's probably not the culture there anymore. But that kind of environment literally isn't possible today. There's no way to demonstrate that you are working hard simply by your physical presence. And so we're in this environment right now, and as the world becomes more and more remote, where trust is not like a thing that high performing teams have. Trust is like a thing that you will have if you are going to continue to work together successfully at all. If you're in a low trust environment, your team like simply will not continue to function. And so like trusting that other people are not stepping on your toes and that everyone's operating with the best of intentions, like that's a requirement. Like putting communications out in public as opposed to in DMs is a requirement. Like as soon as these like tenuous threads that we all have to each other via Zoom calls and Slack, if they fray at all, like you're just not in good shape. The other thing that I wanted to add to the other answers is just that writing skills are not necessarily natural for everyone. I love writing. I've been like blogging since I was in college 20 years ago, scarily long ago. I really enjoy it, but there have been folks on our team who, you know, it's such an effective way to communicate right now that folks have indicated that this is like a challenge for them. And so we've actually bought books on technical writing. We've like started to get an internal training together on just developing written communication skills, because it's something that a lot of us have not had to spend a lot of time doing for a long time.
That's really interesting. Yeah, Emily,
I'll add to that writing is super hard. I'd rather go to the dentist than write, but writing is a huge part of our culture at GitLab. The one thing we've seen is really enabling people to work in whatever form they prefer. So sometimes we're seeing this pattern where instead of writing a response, people will hop on a solo Zoom and record themselves and upload it to YouTube. And then what they're sharing is a video link. And that's been really useful too for folks who prefer that medium. And one's not better than the other. I think as long as you're enabling people to understand the why behind decisions and working asynchronously by leveraging those forms of communication, you still open up the opportunity for teams to really level up their collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just want to, I mean, this all rings out to me as like so just accurate and really on the nose. And I think, you know, one of the things that we were really fortunate to do on my team at Automattic is we really explicitly stated like what our team's values were. And one of them that I think is kind of easy to sort of overlook in the conversation about trust and communication is the idea of vulnerability, especially when you're building this organization and you're trying to create a place where people are able to also love short toes. I'll credit y'all the first 2 times and then I'm taking it, then it's mine. This idea of like, if you want to, it's very easy to just say like, here's what we're going to do, or here's what we need to do, and then execute on it and assume that the momentum is going to carry it correctly. Much like more challenging, especially in a highly collaborative, highly communicative culture, is to explain the context behind it. Like, here's why I think that, here's what drives me to make this decision, because you're sort of exposing your internal state about it. Do you know what I mean? it does make the collaboration better, I think. But it's worth noting, especially for folks in like leadership positions, that to ask someone like, please don't just tell me what we need to do next, but like, what made you think that that's the right thing to do? Because that can be like a scary prospect, I think, for people.
It's super quick. Somebody in the Q&A asked about books on writing. There's a couple that we've used internally. I don't remember all of them. The one that comes to mind immediately is called The Sense of Style by Steven Pinker. So take that for what it's worth. I'm not an expert on this, but we've been using that internally and I've liked it.
Cool, awesome. I actually want to dig a little bit on the written communication bit. Emily, I know that you've talked a lot about documentation. What kinds of documentation do people actually read?
Yeah, I think the first, because documentation feels like such a loaded term. People are like, documentation. And there's always like a bit of eye roll in people's heads when they hear that or when they're asked to write documentation. And I think what's important to remember is that especially for fast-moving, high-growth companies, your company is evolving so quickly. Your documentation needs to evolve right with you. And the way this manifests at GitLab is our GitLab handbook. So about.gitlab.com/handbook has our handbook. If it were printed and put into a stack, it would be 5,000 pages today, which is crazy. When I joined GitLab, it was 3,000. Tristan's face right now. Yes, it is 5,000 pages. But this is how people can find the answers to their own question. So when you want to know, hey, what's our policy on, desks, buying a desk when you join the company, you can just Google GitLab handbook desk reimbursement, and you're going to find the answer. What are our OKRs for the quarter? Same thing. And you start building this culture of people being self-sufficient and finding their answers. And in a world where you can't shoulder tap your neighbor, that's how people get the answers they need. And the trade-off to that is once you see people buy in, if they're working self-sufficiently, they're finding the answers to their own questions, they buy into this idea of documentation. And so they contribute to it. And as you go throughout the day, things come up, questions will pop up where people don't know the answer. We have a questions channel in Slack that's kind of like a catch-all. Whatever question, it might range from like, hey, how do I do this thing, to like, why does this feature work this way? Real variety of responses. But the ask we have of people is, if you are going to ask a question here and someone responds to it, it's on you to document that answer so that people can find it next time. And that will really level up the commitment that people have to documentation. They buy in because they see the value, and then they contribute to it because they want to help others.
Got it. That's really helpful. You talked about the handbook, and I was going through the handbook last week, and one of the things highlighted in the handbook was there are different stages of transition of a company from like non-remote to fully remote. So I'd love for you to touch on the various stages, and does documentation and how you document things change for each one of those stages, or is it the same throughout? Yeah,
that's a really great question. We call that the phases of remote adaptation. I'll drop a link to the chat after I'm done, but the short version is that companies start by moving what they've always done in an office, and they put it in a Zoom room. So instead of a conference room, it's in a Zoom room. Instead of at a water cooler, you might have a random channel in Slack. And instead of clapping, you send people really enthusiastic GIFs, right? And that is just moving from in-person to online. This is probably the place that a lot of companies that are finding themselves suddenly remote are in right now. You've just kind of moved and are trying to figure out how things work. And they're starting to realize that, oh man, we don't have these processes. It's harder. There's a lot of shoulder tapping, virtual shoulder tapping going on. The next phase is where people start to recognize the efficiencies that come from remote work. So that might be where you, instead of having a daily stand-up meeting, you have a stand-up bot. Or instead of having a weekly grooming meeting, you move that to asynchronous. And you start to really see the opportunity that comes with asynchronous communication in remote work. And then the third phase is where companies really double down on this idea by committing to fully remote, by getting rid of their office or eliminating an HQ and really leveling the playing field for all their team members. Simon, have you seen this sort of transition before?
I really like the formalization of this kind of into tiers and into steps. And it rings out to me a little bit the way my friend Big Dave explained what going vegetarian is like. That is, he said, you know, if you look at any given meal you eat, it's probably already 80% vegetarian. And I think that especially for people in modern companies, if they look at the way that they're actually spending their day on email and on phone calls and in like many times documentation or Excel docs or whatever, like they're already working remotely like for so much of their day. I've never really kind of put it in this tier structure, and I really like this. I think it's a way for people to say like, look, this is just a journey. Like this is a spectrum. You're already on it, and all you need to do is sort of bump yourself over that other 20%. I like that a lot.
We went remote because, well, we're not fully remote. We have 25 folks on the team, and 15 of us are in Philadelphia. But there was, and this is another thing that I'll have to dig up the link to, and we can distribute it afterwards. But there was a blog post that we read in a blog called Rand in Repose. I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but it's about how to build organizations that are not just like remote okay, but that if you have an HQ and you also have remote employees, that those remote employees actually feel supported. And there's a ton of tips that we have used in there, like get to the conference room early, get the video conferencing all set up so that like that person that is remote doesn't join last. So anyway, as we've grown the team, we've had to find talent wherever talent is. And so that's pushed us in the direction of going more remote. I wanted to give it a shout out to Emily on the handbook. I know you didn't write all 5,000 pages by yourself, but we at Fishtown Analytics, we don't have the resources to come up with our own 5,000 page handbook yet. But the great thing about GitLabs is that it's available publicly, or a majority of it is anyway. So anytime we want to know what our policy should be on XYZ, we actually just go to the GitLab handbook and say like, what do these guys do? They're smart. And so there's documentation serves many, like once you've written something down, internal people can advocate, or it can use that. And then it can also become like a brand building thing. Like we end up talking about GitLab a lot in contexts that have literally nothing to do with the GitLab product, just because we use their resources in other ways.
Yeah, super strong +1 to that. I recently onboarded a new hire, and one of their first tasks was just improving the documentation around like our style guides, especially for code standards. And I literally linked to the GitLab standards, and I was like, just do this, but for us. Yeah, it's such a great resource. For sure, agree.
Let's actually dig in a little bit deeper into that documentation. So one of the questions that has come in is, with such large amounts of documentation, how do you keep up with the sheer volume, especially as things change over time? Who's owning what? And especially when things change over time, people leave, people join. How does that work, Emily?
Yeah, so to change something in the handbook, we make a merge request. And that's true for everyone at GitLab. It's not just an engineer, but also like accounting and marketing. If you want to make a change to the handbook, you create a merge request to do so. And so there's a bit of change management involved in that, where someone's got to make the change, someone's got to merge the change. But in terms of keeping up with processes, part of it is realizing that the handbook is a living, breathing document that is constantly changing. And rather than remember, hey, how do I submit my expense reports every month? The answer is, where is that information stored in the handbook, and how do I go find it so that you can reference it? There's not a need to memorize how things are done when you can go find the answer whenever you need it. And the advantage of the handbook being public, anyone can use their search engine of choice over it. So like when I need to find information in the handbook, which I do all day long, I just use site:/about.gitlab.com/handbook, and then whatever key phrases I'm looking for. And I get to take advantage of my search engine to find that information. There's not a moment that you sit down and read the whole thing and you're like, okay, I know everything about GitLab. Like when I joined GitLab 2 years ago, we were, like I said, a 3,000 page handbook, and we're at 5K now. I couldn't possibly read all that.
Emily mentioned that it's, yeah, I was hoping to transition to your next question anyway, Sid. Emily mentioned that there's change management associated with getting things into Git and having folks across the organization use Git who might not have previously, and for this purpose, it doesn't matter whether you call it a pull request or a merge request, or like what service provider you use, like it's all Git. And there, I think that tooling and workflow is so critical for the remote question. Back to my statement about open source software engineers have like been doing this longer than anybody else. Git was originally built by Linus Torvalds as a mechanism to allow the Linux kernel developers to collaborate remotely together. It is like the first class tool of like remote production. My guess is that there are going to be folks on this call who are not, who don't see themselves primarily as people who write code, who, there are certainly even more people in your organization who don't write code as the primary thing that you do. Git can be extremely scary if you, if the only thing that you do is like start on the command line and stay there and start Googling things about how I, fix this screw up that I just got myself into. But it can actually be very straightforward if you use GUI-based tools, if you use, there's actually like the main Git hosting services have the ability to like edit markdown files live in the browser. Like it doesn't have to be overwhelming. And I just want to push folks to, I think that if you're gonna work together remotely, you have to adopt first-class remote tooling in order to do that. And that's one of the ways that we think about setting up our data workflows as a data company, is that 100% of the work that we do must be Gitable. There are plenty of data products that they aren't really, you can't really check the assets into a repo and like do a merge request on top of it. Excel, Tableau, like you just like can't do a merge request on top of a Tableau workbook. And so we always choose tools that allow us to adopt those types of workflows, because without them, like I legitimately don't know how to run a data team that uses Excel and Tableau as the first class tools in a remote friendly way. It's just like not that easy to do. So I think that the way that you actually produce the work needs to be aligned with the kind of work style that everyone's using.
Yeah, strong agree. And I think there's sort of a social scaffold that's the other side of that first class tooling stack, right? Which is sort of having appropriate processes in place. And one of those is like documentation checking and updating, right? The idea is you want to let people use that stack of tools. You need to get rid of all of your alignment problems, right? Alignment problems are the bane of remote organizations. And that an alignment problem is anything that you can solve if everybody just makes a decision and agrees to do something one way, right? If you've got a fully remote company and every team is using a different like project management tool, like that's an alignment problem, right? It might be good for each individual team, but everybody would be better off if everybody just decided to do a single thing. And I see that like tooling stack as a way to solve alignment problems, right? It's like, look, what y'all want to do is solve data problems. What y'all want to do is like run an accounting team. You don't really care what tool you use, right? And you don't want to spend your time trying to decide between Asana and Trello. What you want to do is your job. You want to do the thing that gets you fired up. And I think a good stack and a good set of processes around it, like that's it. Like that is so key in a co-located environment, of course, but remotely even more so, because it's very, very easy to accept that remote environment as permission to not be aligned with everybody else on your organization.
I agree. I have two follow-up questions to that, Tristan. You bring up a lot of the things that engineers have been doing as or following as best practices can actually be reused internally within the data teams. Besides Git, are there any other things that come to mind as far as the best engineering practices go? And the second part of the question is, how do we collaborate outside of our data team with non-analytics teams like marketing, sales, and operations? Any best practices there?
Gosh, do you mind if I go to the second part of that first? I think that the biggest bottleneck between the data team and the rest of the organization is communication about the status of things. So like, did this run? Why did this error happen? Why does my dashboard look like this? How did you build this thing? And does it answer my question this way? There's just like a tremendous amount of knowledge that the data team has that the rest of the organization needs. And so you get back into this question about documentation. Now, while the handbook that we've been talking about, the Behemoth GitLab handbook, is a good solution for a long-lived asset. Like in a year, the GitLab handbook is only going to be more built out. No one's going to like rip up but as we all know, data changes very quickly. And, you know, if you had a 5,000 page doc in a year, you might have to rewrite the whole damn thing. So I think that documentation is actually critical to solve this particular alignment problem between the business and the data team, but you need to do it in a way that like your tooling provides more of that documentation itself. And we think a lot about this in DBT. DBT provides auto documentation that allows you to gives you the scaffolding to do that. And then you can enrich it with your own text-based documentation as well. I guess, and there's plenty of other ways to do this. DBT is certainly not the only way to do it. But in solving that alignment problem, I think that you have to figure out like, how do you with the least amount of friction, give people the information that they need to self-service from the rest of the business without them pinging you on stuff. That's the worst thing ever, is like the pile up of like just fairly straightforward questions from folks in the rest of the org.
Yeah, I think that's pretty spot on, and that's at the core of writing things down, whatever way you do it. Like the GitLab handbook is part of that. At GitLab, we use DBT, and our DBT docs are also public, dbt.gitlabdata.com, and you can see how we're documenting our tables and how we're documenting the columns in those tables as starting points. But one thing we've encouraged people to do when they have questions about data is like, start searching for the keywords you're looking for, like customers or revenue or Salesforce or opportunities or usage or whatever the keyword is. And if we've done a good job and that data exists, that keyword is going to help get you to your answer. And that's at the core of this, which is whatever workflow you choose, whatever tooling you choose, you need to make it so that people can help themselves to their own answers, because that's where you eliminate those shoulder taps and really unlock new forms of productivity.
Agreed. I want to dig a little bit deeper into that tooling discussion. Simon, you've been at WordPress.com through multiple work cycles and technology waves. What tools are still your go-to, and what are some of the new ones that have worked for you? Be it, working with your fellow analysts within the data team, or be it working with, marketing, sales, and operations folks.
I really want to answer this question, but can I actually? This might be rude. Emily, I know you're working in a strategy role, like in more umbrella sort of way. Could we actually take one step back? I kind of really want to hear Emily's answer to the communication question. Like, how does data get communicated across like disparate departments?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, happy to answer.
Thanks.
So
sorry to break up the pace.
No. If you have this question, other people do. So I think it's a great question to ask. One of the unique things about my background that I bring to my role right now is that I was the first data analyst at GitLab, and a lot of the data stuff lives in my head. And so when we're on a meeting and a question comes up, I can just open a Snowflake window real fast and write a query that answers the question. In terms of communicating across the org, what we have is a bit of a hub and spoke model where we have a central data team that lives in our G&A cost center, and then different team members are specialized in different parts of the org. So in our data engineering team, we have 3 or 4 data engineers, and they're split up by cost center. So one does G&A, one does R&D, and then one does, cost go to market and sales and marketing. So, and then our data analysts are kind of divided even more detailed among that. So instead of just having a G&A data analyst, we have a finance one and a people one. Instead of just having an R&D one, we have multiple allocated towards product and one on engineering. And that allows people to build a domain knowledge, but also have the advantage of a central way of working. Different people on the team have different backgrounds, but we had a team member who was in a fully distributed org in his last role, and what he found was that there was a lot of duplicative work where every team just had their own data analysts without a centralization, where teams were all independent, not communicating with each other. The end result was people would do the same thing over and over without knowing that other teams were doing it. But I'd be curious, Tristan, what have you seen amongst the variety of organizations you've worked with, and what do you recommend to teams that come to this question with you?
Oh, geez. I actually am probably not an expert on that, as you might think. The folks who do, we have a 25-person organization that I run, and so we have like no communication problems because we can all just like be in general together, and there's not that much chatter. But the folks on my team are actually better because they end up embedded in these like super large organizations. When we advise folks on how they should solve this problem for their companies, it very much is the way that you're talking about, how you create a centralized organization that has dotted lines to their like partner organizations that they're embedded in. And so the reporting structure is like you're reporting to somebody who's also an expert in what you do, but you work very closely with the business partners, and that we've found that like hybrid model works the best. So, I mean, you're not going to get out of answering Sid's question.
It's really carefully not making eye contact. I guess that doesn't work in a Zoom call. We're in a little bit of, we're in sort of a fortunate but challenging position right now. We do have a single sort of centralized data organization within WordPress.com. But then we also have, I guess I would call them analytics engineers working in like the finance group. And for example, the different companies under the Automattic umbrella have their own data operations often. Like WooCommerce has like 3 or 4 analyst developers, and Tumblr has got its own standalone like data division, right? And that question, like how do we cohere? How do we collaborate? Like how do we make meaningful efficiency gains in this way? I mean, I asked because I really want to know. Right? Like I don't really know. Sort of the future of the organization is a little bit of a question. I know that in general, sort of the way that Emily describes individual analysts out there in the world without the scaffolding of a broader centralized data organization, I think that's a really challenging position to put people in, especially in a remote environment, which I guess is the environment everyone's in right now, because they sort of end up getting just totally, they just live on the sort of data request hamster wheel. They never get an opportunity to build out a more meaningful zoomed out pipeline. They like read about data ops on Twitter, but never get a chance to actually invoke any of it, right? And I think that is sort of the great benefit of that centralized, more sort of federated or federal data organization, is it allows people to level up. It allows people to have a community of practice. But how do you do that in a way that doesn't then sort of create inefficient dictates to the people working for it? I don't know. It's a work in progress for sure. but it's a really interesting puzzle. Maybe that's it. Maybe that's the next webinar is sort of data organization.
Well, it gets to the stuff we were talking about earlier, like trust and collaboration and all of this. Like the challenges that you're talking about aren't going to be solved by drawing lines on an org chart. Like you can get as close to right on the org chart as you can get, but it's fundamentally going to be people who are all aligned trying to achieve the same thing that like gets you the results you're looking for.
For sure, I don't disagree at all. But I mean, lines on an org chart can be important. I mean, they do indicate like how like people in groups should sort of work together. It's when that becomes like coercive or inefficient for other reasons, right? That's when it becomes problematic.
100%. I'm sorry. All I'm trying to say is that we frequently get asked, how do I draw my org chart such that my people will work together?
Oh, sure.
And it's just like, that's the wrong way of thinking about that question. It's like, well, you have to have people who are all interested in achieving the same objectives and are aligned around how that should be happening. And then, and then like the org chart is an important part of that, but it's not the only part of the solution.
Yeah, it's it should reflect reality, right? And not the other way around. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a good point. Okay.
Awesome.
Thank you for the detour there. I appreciate it, y'all.
No, thank you, Simon, for taking the question head on. Okay, so we have about 17 odd minutes left. So the final question that I have is about onboarding new team members. I know that each one of you has a different approach, process, and product. What's the hardest thing for a new team member to adapt to that you've seen in your experience?
If you've never used Git before, your first week at GitLab is certainly going to be interesting. Not just Git, but if you've never used a tool like GitLab. So we not only use merge requests to manage the handbook, but all of our teams work out of GitLab. And that means things like our accounting team closes the books every month using a GitLab issue. Our marketing team plans their field events using GitLab issues and epics and boards, and you can see progress along the way. So that's definitely part of it. And in some ways, we throw you into the deep end a little bit when you onboard to GitLab, and I'll drop a link to this in the chat. You get a 250 item checklist that you have to complete over your first week, and then some subsequent things in weeks 2 to 4. And we do that for the company for general onboarding, and then we also have role-specific onboarding. And what we found is that it is the easiest way to constantly iterate on our onboarding to make it better for new team members. And there is a learning curve, but once you get through that first week and you add yourself to the team page on day 5, and you've now, especially if you've never worked in an engineering-like role before, but in your first week, when you figure out where to add your picture using a file directory, add yourself to a YAML file, and you show up on the team page, boy, is that satisfaction.
Awesome. Simon.
Yeah,
you'd like that?
The sort of biggest challenge that we've seen, especially from folks coming from non-remote organizations, has been, you know, it's really easy to say out loud and in documentation and on Slack that you know, these processes are living processes, these documents are living documents, and it's all of our job to like make them as effective as we can. To get people to shift into that mindset to not hold things really precious has been kind of hard, and I'm still not really sure how to do it in the right way, and how to communicate about it, because I think this idea of distributed ownership as well as the distributed workforce, that's kind of interesting. This idea of distributed ownership of documentation and processes, I think feels really strange to people coming from like much more rigid, much more traditional workplaces. And sort of, you know, knowing when to put something on P2 and when to ask a question in Slack, like those things are challenging, but really that sort of mindset around, and I think maybe part of that too is imposter syndrome, right? Like how do I know that what I have to say is important enough to like change this process? Yeah, that's the biggest challenge that I see. I mean, I don't have a great answer. This isn't one where it's like, here's my challenge and here's, you know, sign up for my newsletter. I'll tell you how I solved it. I haven't. I don't know how to fix it, but it's something I see kind of a lot.
We have a very similar process to what Emily described at GitLab, where it's not nearly as built out, but we have a series of things that you're supposed to do in your first week, second week, third week, etc. And we use cards to manage that in Trello, and you like drag them to done when you're finished. And one of the things that we do there, and I'm curious if you folks do this as well, Emily, we have like actual social engagements in that list. Like, you must schedule coffee with X person. You're nodding your head. That's something you also do?
Yeah, on day 2, you're supposed to schedule 5 coffee chats with people around the organization.
Yeah, because it's easy to forget that remote onboarding is as much about like starting to build the social ties as it is, because like the social ties still matter. It's not like, oh, we never see each other in person, so like social ties don't matter. They still really do. So we make sure to put those things on the list. My role in onboarding is that I talk about our mission statement to every single person who joins. And that's something I take really seriously because, you know, in an environment where everybody is working in an office together, you kind of like start caring about the organization first because you get to know these people and you care about the people. But if you don't ever see the people, like, you might not actually have quite as much of a bond with those other humans. And so you find that like the thing that you're all primarily aligned around and that you have in common is like, you're here to advance this mission. And so if I do a terrible job at, you know, getting new people onboarded with an understanding of that mission, then like, well, we as a company are not going to be that cohesive. But I don't know. That's one of those things that's like a scale problem. How are we going to do that forever? But I'll figure that out in the future.
Yeah. Go ahead, Simon.
Oh no, it's okay. No worries.
I'll add to that I don't think that's true only in work environments. I think that's true in just like general online relationships. Mm-hmm. So for example, Simon, we've never met in person. We've only talked on Zoom calls, and Tristan, we've only met in person, what, twice over the last
Wait, was it twice?
Twice, I think.
Remember.
And it, you know, but it's still important that, you know, people use clear communication. We understand what we're working towards, and that you build these relationships despite the fact that you're not in the same state, geography. The 3 of us have the luxury of being on the same time zone, but that's not true everywhere. The other thing I'll add here, just since I'm unmuted, is that I think one of the things that evolves over time as a company grows is you realize that there are more things that you add to these onboarding checklists. So for example, the data team checklist that I've linked in the chat, when you onboard to GitLab, when I joined 2 years ago, is like 10 item checklist. And if you go through the Git history, you can see how it's evolved, and everyone joins. And one of the items on that checklist is make this better for the next person who's onboarding to the data team. What could be made clearer? What could be linked to better documentation? Like, every time a new team member joins, they're bringing fresh eyes to the table. Take advantage of that.
If I could just say one piece about this sort of social relationships. This is part of my like spiel that I sort of provide to new hires to the company and other folks who are just starting working remotely. And that is like, one of the things that you get for free in a co-located environment are like casual conversations and like having coffee and seeing someone at lunch. And like, those are relationship builders. Like, that's fuel for like your success at an organization, is those little relationships and little conversations you have over time. And one of the like weird and like uncomfortable things about working remotely is like, you have to create and intentionally do all of these things that otherwise like feel like they come naturally, right? And the first time you like ping a coworker in Slack and you say like, hey, we should get lunch at the same time today and like eat on camera. And they're like, well, what's the agenda? Like, do you need help with something? It's like, no, like, that's going to feel really strange. but it's so important because it is the oil like that keeps the machine moving. Because if the only thing you ask people about is like, I need a code review, I'm still blocked. Like you're not really developing any kind of like charismatic or like energetic relationship. And those are so important.
You are so spot on. One of my greatest GitLab colleagues, Taylor Murphy, he hired me into the team almost 2 years ago. I think we've spent 3 weeks total in person, like total. But we have built those relationships. It requires additional intentionality, like sending a calendar invite for a coffee chat can seem weird at first. But once you get over that hurdle, and we talked about that, like it requires vulnerability. Once you get over that hurdle, what you unlock is so worth the work to get there.
This is awesome. And I'm really enjoying this discussion, y'all. But we just have 7 minutes, and I'm starting to see a lot of questions come in. So I'm going to take a look at those questions and see if we can tackle any one of those. And let's call it like a lightning round. And so we encourage all of the attendees to add questions and vote up to already existing questions if they'd like. So the first one that I see on here, which is really interesting, is how do you identify the highest impact business projects as a data team while working remotely?
The same way you would identify high impact business projects not working remotely, get to know the business really well, understand like what the big levers to its success are, and then make those levers move faster or more powerfully.
Interesting. And how do you make sure that not everyone, because not everyone is comfortable contributing to a virtual brainstorming session? Are there some like tips and tricks that can make sure that everybody is contributing towards a meaningful discussion when you brainstorm on those projects remotely as opposed to in person?
So the first part of that is understanding why someone is expressing that they're not comfortable. Is it that there is not a psychologically safe environment for them to express dissenting opinions, and that's the root problem? Or are they perhaps more introverted and they're uncomfortable being on camera, but they're comfortable speaking? So understanding what the root cause of that concern is the first step, and then you can work to address it. But depending on what that root cause is, the actual answer to the question could be vastly different.
Awesome. So the final question actually is for Tristan. Tristan, you mentioned tool stacks that defeat collaboration. Several people have asked here that what do you see as the tier 1 tool stack for effective teams in terms of descriptive tools, diagnostic tools, and collaborative tools?
Gosh, I don't know how to answer that question in the abstract. I can tell you what we use. We use a lot. Well, we use Slack heavily. We use GitHub heavily. Sorry, Emily. What else? We use Google Drive a lot, but we don't use it for, we use it for like one-off document creation. The documents that are particularly critical and will be edited over a long period of time are all in Git, and they're just like Emily mentioned, like they're contributed to by everyone in our organization, technical or not. We do the thing where we split into teams for issue triaging. A lot of us use Trello, and a lot of us use GitHub issues. I don't know that that's actually created massive problems for us, but you're probably right. It's not ideal. And I think that generally you just like find you don't actually need that many first-class tools. Like, yeah, sure, we use Salesforce on our sales team, but like those tools that I just listed are like the ones that every single person in our organization has an account on. And it's probably like, that's kind of the end of it.
Got it. So let's take one more question, and this is a fun one. What was the most disastrous thing you've tried did anything good come out of it in the end?
Like at work?
At work, yeah, or like working when you started working remotely?
I've got one. Okay. My first ever Zoom call back in 2016 was actually with Tristan. And I had built a culture, or where I had worked had always used Google Hangouts. And the way it worked at the time, I don't know if this is still true, but you click the link to Google Hangouts, and then there was a second like button to turn on your video. So I always used to join that early, and then right before the call, I'd join the second button, so I wasn't late to calls. So I'm working in my office, and I joined the Zoom call, not knowing that it like turns on, joins the call, and turns on the video right away, and then walk out. And the first thing
I do remember that.
When I come back to my desk is like, oh, I just saw someone with red pants walk away from this video. And that's not like a disaster in the grand scheme of things, but I definitely remember that was the first impression I made.
Red pants is not a disaster.
I would have never remembered that at all.
Thank goodness I was wearing pants. Never know when people are working from home.
That's awesome. Okay, so we are right at top of the hour. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Tristan. And thank you, everyone else, for joining us today. Hope this was useful. Have a happy Friday and a great weekend.
Thanks so much. See you folks.
Thanks, y'all. See you on Twitter.